do that. Um, all right, this guy, I went to school with him. All right, I actually ran track with him. Um, his name's Kory. He is a lawyer, and he went to seminary. Okay, so let me be upfront and say I am not a lawyer, and I did not go to seminary. I am a simple pleb who is just doing my simple best to try to figure out what's true and what's not true. And Kory is an apologist for sure, right? We've had a couple conversations about this. He mentioned to me that he was having doubts about his own faith, and so he went to seminary and he got those doubts extinguished. I personally don't think that's the best way to go about addressing your concerns, by being taught how to, you know, argue for them better. But that's my opinion. This is 20 minutes. I was gonna look at his first one. It was like 2 hours long, and absolutely not gonna do that. I'm actually gonna change the playback speed on this, and I never do that. But this is 20 minutes, and I don't imagine the not to be insulting or dismissive. I don't imagine he's going to be speaking quickly enough and nuancedly enough that it's going to matter if we go a little faster. So let's see what he has to say, and we'll talk about these claims.
Welcome to the KR Queen channel, where I evaluate complex questions.
Oh my god! All right, I was like, dude, he's doing real TikTok voice, but I remember I sped him up. That's on me. You're good, Kory.
To you, as though to a jury. Hey everyone, my name is Kory Queen. I'm an attorney in Seattle, Washington. In
True.
law school, I was a campus minister at the University of Tennessee.
Also
2
true.
weeks ago, I posted my first major video on this channel, which was a critique of Alex O'Connor's entire case against Christianity. And since
Okay. So to be upfront here right now, I have watched, I think maybe one video from Alex O'Connor. I know he's like the popular YouTube atheist. I know he's like going all over the place doing presentations and debating random people. I don't know anything about Alex O'Connor. I don't really care. Okay, I don't care. I am a layperson. My opinion on this stuff is basically me trying to investigate what people smarter than me and more qualified than me have said, and try to figure out if they, if it makes sense. Alex O'Connor is basically the same level of qualification as me. Maybe he has some other advanced degree, but he's not a philologist. He's not a biblical scholar, right? He's just like an atheist, as far as I'm aware. He's just a guy who's pretty good at debate and likes to talk to Christians. And also just, I think he's a anti-religion guy, maybe. He talks to a lot of people that aren't Christians. All that to say, I don't really know anything about Alex O'Connor, so I don't care about his stances. The people whose opinions I care about on things like textual criticism and the authenticity of the scripture is like actual experts, PhDs, right? Philologists, people who I have referenced on the channel before, but I'll reference them here because, if I do end up posting this, if Kory ends up watching it, Kory, if you do, hope you and the wife and kids are good. I'm not trying to make this personal, just to preface that. Anyway, the people I tend to lean on for my understanding are people like Dr. Joshua Bowen, who has a PhD from Johns Hopkins, Dr. Kip Davis, who has a PhD from somewhere in Canada, Dr. Bart Ehrman, who I don't know where his Princeton Theological, maybe? I don't remember where his PhD is from, but he is a well-respected scholar in this world, especially in New Testament criticism. All of these people have PhDs from reputable universities and have had academic jobs in the past. So these are the people who I am looking at. I don't care. You should not use me as a reference, right? If you think that I make good arguments, that's great. I am making arguments built on arguments I've seen other people make that I think are compelling. Go listen to their arguments, right? And tell me if you think I have accurately represented them. Or if you think that they don't stand up, right? If you think that I have misapplied or over broadly interpreted something. Okay, I am not an expert. I am not going to pretend to be an expert. I am just a guy who is generally pretty good at Googling stuff. All right? So I just want that to be clear before we go in. In this conversation, this video that I'm going to be watching, I am at a disadvantage because I do not have a secondary degree and I did not go to seminary. It's very possible that he is going to argue some points or bring up some things that I don't have a quick and easy response for. It's okay, right? I can live with that. And if you think that it means that he has owned me and proved that Jesus is God, then that is okay. Go and be a good person with that knowledge, right? Go and live your life in such a way that you are serving others, treating foreigners, queer people, people who don't look like you. You're treating them with respect and dignity, right? If that's what your belief in God brings you to, I am all for it. So if you think that I'm gonna get dunked on, that's fine, right? I can deal with that.
Then I've received hundreds of comments, largely from atheists. And when you get that many comments on the same subject, certain patterns begin to emerge, certain things are said over and over again. So I've decided to address some of the most common ideas that keep cropping up. And when possible,
I will also say he continues, well, in our previous conversations, and I'm sure that he would be past this now because he's an intellectually honest guy. He keeps calling me an atheist. I have stated many times on the channel and elsewhere, I am an agnostic. Right? To many people, there is no difference between atheism and agnosticism, and I understand that. But to me, there is a difference. I am not an atheist. I am an agnostic. So I am, again, at a disadvantage here because I don't know the kind of arguments atheists make because I'm not one.
Try and name the precise fallacy or fallacies that are being committed. But first, one thing that did come up several times was essentially, Alex isn't here to defend himself. Say that to his face. I haven't been in the YouTube world for very long, and I doubt that Alex has seen anything that I've posted, but I have tried to reach out to him before. Even so, let me just appease you. Dear Alex O'Connor, if you would ever like to talk or debate, please let me know. That'll have to do for now. So by far the most common comments that I've gotten is some variation of, there is absolutely zero evidence for Christianity. And there are a few ways to reply to this, but my first reply is this.
In the context of the God discussion, I think it is a ridiculous claim to suggest that there is no evidence for God.
Sheesh, it's a little harsh, Alex, but yeah, what the atheist said.
Okay, this is gonna be a long thing. We'll go through it. I'm gonna be committed to going through this video. Okay, I'm not gonna just stop and play clips and jump around. I'm gonna go through the whole thing because I don't want anybody to think that I'm misrepresenting anything. I don't know why anybody would claim that there is zero justification for people to believe in God or a God, right? I don't know. We'll see what we're talking about with evidence. But like, the sort of evidence that I would be looking for as just say a total secular, no religion at all, right? I'm just open to whatever religion, the Elijah and the prophets of Baal, right? The great God off, as my dad calls it. Listen, I'm looking to be convinced, all right? This God over here sounds pretty interesting. I like what they have to say. This God over here, I don't know. It's pretty militant for me. That's not really so much my speed. I don't really want to get into the Assyrian army. This God down here, well, okay, some interesting ideas. What can you show me to indicate that you are more powerful or more important than these other gods that I'm being asked about, right? To me, that pretty much does come down to something miraculous, something supernatural. Maybe I have too broad a brush. Maybe I am taking too high a view of this. But if you are saying that you are a god and that you control this, that, and the other thing, I'm going to need to see you prove that to me so that I know that it's real. You say you command the thunderstorms, right? Okay, well, make it rain, right? Can you make it rain? If you can't make it rain and your claim is that you can make it rain, then I guess I don't believe you, right? If your claim is I can make it rain, but only if if certain things are accomplished, then I kind of don't think you're very powerful, right? If your actions as a god are dependent on my actions as a mortal being who you created, ostensibly, because, God created us, why do you need us to do stuff? You couldn't do it before? You couldn't do it before there were humans? So, anyway, I don't know what we're going to talk about evidence, but that is, for me, the kind of evidence I would require to be convinced, right? To have it be proven. There are plenty of things that you can point to suggest that people really believe in God and that people really thought God was real and really want him to be real. And you can see that by how Christianity spread and how we have all these copies of these texts. Right? You can talk about that. But that people being really into something is not the same as there being evidence that what they're into is real. Because Kory is a Christian. Okay? I used to be a Christian. I would not look at Hindus and say, well, they really believe their stuff. They've got texts dating back 2,500 years. Their God must be real, because that the Bible says that their God isn't real. Right? So just believing strongly in something, even over many, many years, even being evangelistic about it, is even being willing to die for it, is not proof that what you believe in is real. It's just proof that you believe in it. Okay? Let's be very clear about that.
There's zero evidence for Christianity commits the fallacy of stop being ridiculous. No one who's given this any serious thought would ever say that, and you lose all credibility when you say it. Our entire universe began to exist. That is evidence. Our universe is complex and functional. Evidence. The witness testimonies around Jesus.
The evidence for God? I don't think so. Evidence that at one point there was not a universe that we know, and then at another point there was. Sure. I mean, this is a classic Christian argument, because you can't go and reproduce the Big Bang, right? I can't prove the Big Bang happened. You can't prove God created the universe. We don't have to discuss this. This is my stance. Again, you may disagree with me, but to me, the world started. The universe happened at one point. It started. And how did that happen? I don't know. Scientists have some ideas. Christians have some ideas. Other religions have some ideas. They can't all be right. And we can't reproduce any of them currently. So I find this one sort of well, you can't prove my side and I can't prove your side, so let's call it a wash and move on to something else that we can discuss.
Life, death, and resurrection. Evidence. What G.K. Chesterton called the choking.
Okay. Magic is evidence of God. I'm just going to mark it down here. The 2 minutes. This is the first explicit God breaking the laws of physics. God going outside of the... Now, the Bible says God did that several times. There are many people in the Bible who were able to raise the dead. Elijah. I think Elisha also was able to raise the dead. The widow at Endor, who raised the prophet Samuel's spirit so that Saul could talk to him. And then obviously Jesus. But also some of the apostles were able to raise the dead. So a lot of people raising the dead in the, in the Levant, in the late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, and into the modern era. But again, people believing in something is not the same as it being true. A lot of people believe that Minecraft is the best game ever invented, and they're wrong, because the best game ever invented is Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. And that's factual, and you can't prove me wrong. You understand how that is sort of I believe it. That's what I think. That doesn't make it real.
Interactive eyewitness testimony about supernatural events. Evidence. Saying
eyewitness testimony is pretty unreliable, and Kory is a lawyer, so I'm sure he's not going to belabor this point about eyewitness testimony, particularly eyewitness testimony that is recorded something like 40 years after the alleged events, and the eyewitnesses are not named. And and they didn't write it down themselves. And even if they were named, that doesn't help us, because how many Yakovs were there in first century Palestine? Anyway, this is not a big useful point here. And maybe I am just setting up straw men and knocking them down. Kory wants to talk about logical fallacies. Maybe I am front loading here, and he's not going to talk about any of these things that I'm bringing up. And that's fair enough. I haven't watched the video yet. This is a fresh watch for me. But these are the objections that I have immediately. And since we're not having an actual conversation, I can break down a sentence and I can say my thoughts on it, and then we can move on. I don't say this to take a shot at anybody. The way real debate works, the way real like conversations like this work is somebody brings up 3 or 4 things and you want to address them point by point, and it never happens because you start to address a point and then you get a counter response to that point and then you start addressing that point, and that's just how it goes. Both sides do it. I do it. Kory does it. Everybody does it. It's just natural. So I'm not saying this to again, I'm not trying to be insulting here. I'm not trying to make Kory look bad or sound bad by saying that I'm able to respond to each statement here without a lot of interruption. But it's the nature of the project is because there is no response, I can just go through a point and move on. Anyway, on we go.
No evidence just proves that you have no idea what the word evidence actually means. If you're interested in learning about evidence, you can start with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on evidence. I've linked it in the
Oh, great. We're going to the encyclopedia, folks.
Now, when you bring this up, atheists will often say, yeah, but I want testable, falsifiable, measurable evidence. And so what they're getting at is empirical, scientific evidence. And if someone suggests that the only
True.
evidence that
That's
can
what
be
I want.
empirical, one question that you can ask is, do you run the experiments yourself, or do you accept the results on the testimony of someone else? Because if it's the latter, then credible eyewitness testimony apparently sometimes holds some weight for you. And there are other questions we can ask. What happens when scientists disagree about the results?
Okay. This would be a reasonable argument to make. And it may be a reasonable argument to make. I'm not trying to fully dismiss it out of hand. But I would say there's a difference between eyewitness testimony of the person who did an experiment, and maybe they recorded it, maybe they took a video of it, but they did the experiment, and then they come tell you about the experiment. There is a difference between that and a bunch of unnamed eyewitnesses who get written about first. Now, Paul maybe was first. Scholars tend to date Mark to around 70. It seems to be the consensus. Jesus lived somewhere between 6 and 4 BCE up to somewhere around 30 AD. Obviously, most people think 33 because he was 33 when he died, but most people would also agree that Jesus wasn't actually born in year 0. That's just sort of the year that we consider to be the year Jesus was born. Most people would say 4 BC, I think, is the standard. So anyway, around 30 BC, or 30 CE. So we're talking about a gap of 40 years before, as far as we are aware, before Mark is composed. That's a lot of time for eyewitness testimony to shift and change. And I can't say that it did, right? I'm not able to say that. We don't know who any of these alleged eyewitnesses were. But it is reasonable to think that over the course of 40 years, especially if you're writing with sort of a political project in mind, there might be some convenient eyewitness testimonies. Or they could be totally invented. Like, it could be totally invented that there were witnesses who saw him. Doesn't have to be, but it could be. How would you know? How would you be able to go back and ask Mark, hey, you said there were all these eyewitnesses that saw Jesus after he was raised from the dead. Where are they? Right? Anyway, I do sometimes belabor a point. I try not to.
What happens when the scientists agree on the results but disagree on the implications of those results? How do we mediate that conflict? In all of my cases, there are expert medical doctors, economists, engineers, and others on both sides of the case who disagree with each other. How is the jury to decide which scientist is right when the dispute is about how to interpret empirical evidence? I can tell you how you won't mediate that conflict, and that's with empirical evidence. That's precisely the evidence in dispute, and to resolve that dispute, we have to bring in other kinds of evidence, logical deductions, first-hand testimony, evidence of bias, and so on. The strict empiricism by which atheists commonly claim there is zero evidence for Christianity is useless in many settings. It won't help you to evaluate any historical claim. Atheists love to bring up the bad things that Christians have done in the past, the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, twisting the Bible to...
I have brought that up to him specifically. I don't think he's talking about me. I don't think I rank that highly, but I have brought that up. Like, I mean, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the historical persecution of Jews through the entire world for genuinely thousands of years, those were perpetrated by Christians. The slave trade, right? Those were perpetrated by Christians. I don't think that all Christians are responsible for the Crusades, and I don't think all Christians are responsible for the slave trade. But it is unavoidable, if you're going to be honest about the history of the religion that I grew up in and the religion that Kory is still a member of, you have to be honest about the history. And a lot of that history is really bad. And some of it is not. Christians did a lot of good things. I would not dispute that. But you have to acknowledge the real harm done by Christians for genuinely 2,000 years. Basically from, let's say 1,500 years. Okay, we'll date it to like Constantine. Christianity becoming the official language, religion of Rome, and then forward to like the 1800s. Okay, and then we'll call it at that. So 1,500 years.
On their strict empiricism, there is absolutely zero evidence that any of those things happened. The only repeatable, falsifiable scientific test.
There is zero evidence, empirical evidence, that the Inquisition happened. All right. I don't want to be a definitions guy, but we'll just look up what exactly, because he's a lawyer. So I'm sure he is a very specific interpretation of what empirical evidence is. So I'm going to try and find this. Through sense experience or experimental procedure. So, firsthand, I guess, is what we're talking about. Basically, you did the experiment yourself. I mean, you can do firsthand historical work on things like the Inquisition or things like the Crusades, because you can go and see the evidence for when they happened, and you can investigate the fragments of shells that were left. You can see the armor. You can see the writings. You can look at the taxes that were levied on people by the Pope to pay for the Crusades. You weren't there, right? But you can go and see these firsthand documents and the physical evidence for the things that you are investigating. You can see the torture instruments and whatnot from the Inquisition. And I guess you could argue that it was all faked after the fact to make Catholics look bad. But that would be stretching credulity, I think. And I think that we could agree on that doesn't really work. Directly or indirectly through observation or experimentation. So you can do direct observation of many of these things, right? You can't do direct observation of the resurrection because that's a thing that either happened or it didn't, but you can't reproduce it and you can't go visit it and prove that it did happen, right? All we have are claims that are secondhand and written down many years after the alleged event took place. We don't have any real contemporaneous accounts. We have what claim to be contemporaneous accounts, or I guess sort of insinuate that they are.
That could demonstrate that the Spanish Inquisition really happened would be a time machine. My, how the goalposts have moved. The point is, it's not rational to stick empirical evidence in the document. Empirical evidence is useful, but it has its limits. You won't prove that a portrait was painted by enumerating the chemicals in the paint, and if God exists, he won't be available for a skin sample. I mean, he might walk the earth and fulfill centuries of prophecies and perform a bunch of miracles.
Do you think that there is sufficient evidence to believe that the Inquisition happened? If you believe that there... Again, I think we're talking about slightly different interpretations of empirical here. Kory, I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that Kory is saying here, evidence that is obtained by first-hand experimentation. And even then, this still works. You could go to Spain. You could go to, maybe not right now. You might not go to the Levant right now. But you could go and see the evidence of the Knights Hospitaller, right? All of the evidence for the Crusades. All of the various... I read a book by Barbara Tuchman that talks about the Crusades, and there's a lot of contemporary documentation that still exists. Autographs, first-hand stuff, not copies, not later texts claiming to be earlier texts. So you can go investigate that stuff, and then you can say, based on the available evidence, based on the texts that I have read, this seems to have happened. In the real world, there was a crusade.
In front of everyone to make his divine power are obvious, but no skin samples. This does lead to another fallacy committed by those who claim there's zero evidence for God's existence, and that's the overwhelming exception fallacy. It's where you make a generalization, but then you have to modify the generalization so drastically that it becomes meaningless. So you claim there's zero evidence, but when we unpack what you mean by evidence, the statement becomes rather anemic. And here's an example of the overwhelming exception fallacy.
Hilarious Monty Python clip. I do enjoy this clip from the life of Brian. Monty Python were a very funny sketch group.
Right. Apart from the beginning of our observable universe, its intricate fine-tuning, numerous fulfilled prophecies, and numerous
Okay, we're bringing up fulfilled prophecies here. I don't know what ones those are that he's referring to, but in my past several months of really digging into like Old Testament criticism, I have learned a lot about Old Testament prophecies, and I'm gonna need some. Look, this is not a video directed at me. This is a video really directed at other Christians. Okay, this is a video designed to help Christians feel more comfortable with their beliefs, and I totally understand that. I would have made it if I was in college, right, and I was still a Christian, and I thought these atheists are just making my fellow Christians nervous, and I need to help them defend the faith, right? So I understand this video is not directed at me, and he's not making this video to go point by point, right? He did that Alex O'Connor video that's 2 hours long, and maybe I will watch it. I do not make a promise to watch it because I don't care about Alex O'Connor. I don't care if he debunks Alex O'Connor. I don't care. Interview Kip Davis. Interview Joshua Bowen. Talk to these philologists who understand Aramaic and Syriac and can read Sumerian and Akkadian. Go talk to them and debunk them, and then I will be more interested in watching that because I feel like I'll learn something. Anyway, we're talking about fulfilled prophecies now, which has not come up yet, and I don't know what ones he's talking about.
His testimonies around Jesus and the supernatural in general. What evidence have the Christians ever given us? Finally, the biggest fallacy committed by those who claim there's zero evidence for Christianity is that in saying this, they're undermining the very claim that they are making. It's self-defeating. To make this claim that there's zero evidence, they are limiting evidence to empirical evidence, falsifiable, measurable, testable evidence. This is called scientism. It's the belief that science and the scientific method are the best, if not the only way to render truth about the world and reality. So let's make sure we distinguish between science and scientism. Science is a method. Scientism is a belief system. And do you know how much scientific evidence there is to establish the truth of scientism? Zero. Science can't get you to a worldview or a belief system. You have to bring in other kinds of evidence to get there. So
Fair enough. But again, my belief in the natural order of things and your belief in the supernatural order of things are in conflict. You need to be able to convince me that your perspective that there is magic is more reasonable than my perspective, which is that there is not magic. My evidence for there not being magic is that nobody has ever been shown to be able to do actual magic. Everybody that has claimed to be a magician has been shown to be a fraud or a charlatan of some sort. We have yet to find a real person who can do real magic, okay? Doesn't mean that there couldn't be somebody out there who can do real magic, but we have not found them yet. So the weight of evidence is you have to prove that your side, in the absence of evidence, is right. And all I have to do is say, I have not yet seen something compelling enough to convince me that I am in error.
Atheists who claim there's zero evidence for Christianity are cutting off the branch that they're sitting on. Under the very definition of evidence that they wield against Christianity, there is zero evidence for their own scientific worldview. But really, they don't live as though scientific evidence is the only valid kind, and I certainly haven't thought through the implications of what they're saying. This is just a common statement here in atheist echo chambers that's sort of uncritically, unskeptically accepted. One who says there is zero
Again, because I am an agnostic, I guess I just don't hear these conversations.
evidence for Christianity is committing enough logical fallacies to fill an encyclopedia, which I hope they'll go read, so they'll stop committing them. Or they can just listen to Alex O'Connor and abandon the claim for being his words ridiculous. Another very common idea that has popped up over and over again is similar. Many atheists
Number two.
define faith as belief without evidence. Now, I assume this is a hangover from Richard Dawkins, the biologist in face of early 2000s new atheism.
I have not read anything by Richard Dawkins. I do not co-sign Richard Dawkins. I don't like Richard Dawkins. I don't have any interest in Richard. Remember, I just want to make sure, because if Kory watches this, I want to make sure that I am being very clear about where I stand on this stuff so that we don't have to waste time. with silly accusations. I know almost nothing about Richard Dawkins. I'm sure that at some point my arguments have been influenced by people who listened to Richard Dawkins and thought he was really smart. And I'm sure he is really smart, but I don't care. And he is not somebody who I base any of my personal belief system on. Just so that we're clear on that, I am not going to be pointing to Richard Dawkins to say, this is why okay, I just don't care.
Whose philosophical writings have been cited by philosophers approximately never. No serious philosopher defines faith this way. And yet again, I've linked these
Who cares?
a philosophy article on faith to this video if you'd like to see what the serious thinkers are saying about it. In essence, many define faith as trust or belief, and they believe that one's faith should be proportional.
Faith is the confidence in things hoped for. Let's go back to the Bible definition. Faith is can't remember where it is in the Bible. Also, this is interesting, just historically, and because for a lot of religion, there wasn't really a need for faith. You just did the sacrifices, and if you did the sacrifices, you were good with God, right? You didn't so much have to believe in the God as act as if you believed in the God. And Christianity is all about faith and believing. It's all, Hebrews 11, here we go. It's Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the assurance of what we hope for and confidence of what we do not see. We'll look at the interlinear here just because I can. Is now faith, elpitsomenon, hypostasis, the assurance, the confidence of things, pragmaton, so, pragmatic things. Elenkos, o blepomenon, not being seen. So this is the verse. Okay, this is the biblical definition of faith. I don't know what Kory's definition is, but this is the biblical definition.
To the evidence. Christian apologists often follow classical or evidential models of apologetics, both of which emphasize the various evidences for Christianity. And the Bible itself defines
which is sort of what he's doing.
And the evidence of things not seen.
Hey, Hebrews 11:1.
So defining faith as belief without evidence commits what's called the persuasive definition fallacy. It's a sort of straw man where you define a word differently than your opponent does, and in this case, differently than any serious thinker does, and then you try to tie your opponent to that definition, even though that's not his view. It's a pretty cheap trick. If these atheists thought their position was strong, I would expect them to just engage their opponents with intellectual honesty, rather than putting up straw man definitions to aim their attacks at.
I will engage with intellectual honesty here. You have to have faith that God created the universe and that Jesus rose from the dead. Those things are not replicatable. Those things do not have eyewitnesses that we can go talk to, okay? And they both are things that defy the laws of physics. Or God creating the universe, I'm not a physicist, okay? God creating the universe, maybe that doesn't defy the laws of physics. Maybe the Big Bang Theory. My point being, you can't go back and prove that God created the universe because there's nobody there to see it happen. And you can't, interview God directly and say, hey, God, do you have a MP4, right? Because that's the video format. Do you have an MP4 of how you created the universe? You can't do that. And I think it would be silly to suggest anybody does. So, point being here, you have to believe, based on what you have read in the Bible, that those things happened. You can have all kinds of supporting evidence and supporting ideas that back up why you believe this to give you some sort of foundation, right? You say, well, I think it's reasonable for me to believe this because even though I can't prove it, even though we can't directly observe it, there are the, X, Y, and Z things that exist that make me think that my belief is rational, okay? It is faith because it is something that I cannot prove one way or another, but I believe it, and I believe that I have a reasonable justification for why I believe it, okay? I'm fine with that definition, but at the end of the day, that is still saying, well, I can't prove it, but I believe it. It's not saying that there is no evidence to back up what you are saying, okay? Let me be very clear. It is just saying, I can't prove it. I have what I think is good supporting evidence to justify my belief, but it is just a belief because I cannot prove it.
If an atheist tries to claim that faith is belief without evidence, you can just tell them that's not my definition. It's not a common definition. And if you'd like to stop playing clever word games and actually examine the evidence, let's do that instead. The next idea.
Am I playing clever word games? A genuine question, right? Genuine for the audience. Am I playing clever word games, or am I trying to approach this in a way that is intellectually honest?
Has come up quite a bit is essentially that Christianity is ridiculous or absurd or idiotic. We're cultists, we're mythology believers, some variation of that. Now this commits a number of fallacies. Appeal to the stone fallacy, appeal to ridicule fallacy, style over substance.
Right. Right-wing debate people love to talk about logical fallacies. And I know this because I grew up reading books about logical fallacies when I was a young, homeschooled, conservative Christian son of a preacher. I read a whole book about various kinds of logical fallacies and how to respond to them. And it's not a bad thing to be able to tell when somebody's making a logical, leap that doesn't track. But a lot of the time what happens is you start arguing about the fallacy and you ignore the substance of the comment, which sometimes is substanceless and sometimes isn't.
Fallacy, all variations of, rather than debate the substance of the evidence, I'll just make sweeping accusations with great confidence and hope that can carry the argument. And this was really the bread and butter of new atheism, and it still remains strong today. Again, here's Dawkins, the face of new atheism, just a few months ago.
Who cares about Richard Dawkins?
And you listen to the vicar, and do you kind of notice what a lot of nonsense he talks? I mean, do you really take it seriously that Jesus is the Son of God, Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus was born of a virgin, and that's part of Christianity?
So in light of this sort of scoffing tone, I'll just point out that as a Christian, I find myself in the intellectual company of Augustine, Aquinas,
Great.
Newton, Heisenberg, Faraday, Mendel, Descartes, Kierkegaard, Wittgenstein.
There have been a lot of smart Christians. That is true. I mean, for a lot of people, there was no alternative, right? It was pretty much, you grew up in this part of the world, congratulations, you are a Christian. There are a lot of very smart Muslim scholars who Kory probably is not going to bring up because I don't think he thinks about that very much. There are a lot of really smart Chinese scholars who lived way before Jesus was born. They're awfully smart. They had their own vision of the world and of God, and they were inventing, lots of smart people believe lots of things, and I don't believe that Christianity is correct. I don't believe in God. But I also don't believe that Confucianism or ancestor worship is correct. You can believe in those things, but I don't.
Not to mention many of the great champions of human rights, Mandela, MLK, Wilberforce, Lincoln.
Okay, I will not belabor this point either. I will just say the first people to free themselves from slavery were the Haitians, who did not do it with the aid of Christians. They did it in spite of Christian efforts from England, the US, and France to keep them as slaves, and in fact forced them to pay restitution for the loss of property suffered by the French. Okay, so that's point one on slavery. Point two on slavery is, it is true. Many of the great reformers and abolitionists were Christians, some of whom had previously been slave traders. John Newton. Is that good? Is it good as Malcolm X? And I'm not a big Malcolm X fan. I don't subscribe to his belief system at large, but as Malcolm X said, if you put a knife in my back 9 inches and then you pull it out 6 inches, is that progress? Did you fix the problem that you created by sticking a knife in my back? Right? The knife is still in my back, even if you have made some efforts to take it most of the way out. When slavery was abolished in America, black people didn't instantly become equals to white people, right? They were not treated as equals to white people. They were not conceived of as equals to white people. They were just allowed to not be slaves anymore. And then Jim Crow, and then the civil rights movement eventually in the 60s. That's a lot of time that knife is still very slowly coming out. So, yes, it is good. I will stand up for the fact that Christians were largely the driving force behind abolitionist movements. I agree with that. I would also say that there's a reason the slave Bible exists. There's a reason Thomas Jefferson has black descendants, and it's not because they were treating their slaves so Christianly. Okay, let's just be clear about that. If you're gonna say, hey, they stopped all this bad stuff from happening, well, who started the bad stuff? The people who started the bad stuff were capitalists from Holland, but it was quickly embraced by Christianity, and not just Christians. I will say also, not just Christians. There has been slave trade for many thousands of years, but the specific kind of slave trade that the U.S. Engaged in, the triangular trade, that was an innovation.
And if your beliefs require you to call these people idiots or cultists or their faith and values absurd, then I'm glad I don't share your beliefs. The fact that many of history and modernity's greatest minds have been Christian does not prove that Christianity is true, but it does prove that Christianity is not only for the weak-minded.
I agree with that. This point, I accept. There are a lot of smart people that believe in Christianity. You don't have to be a dumb person to believe in Christianity. I don't think that. But also, who cares? Because a lot of smart people believe in a lot of religions that both Kory and I would have grown up agreeing are not real religions. They don't have the real God. You know, people believe in them, but they're not true, accurate religion, because the true accurate religion is the God who came to the Hebrew people in the Levant. That's the real God, and everybody else doesn't have the real God.
And the ridicule of atheists doesn't threaten this. It only demonstrates that they have baseless confidence in their worldview. Blind faith, you might call it. Another very common claim that I've seen over and over again is that Jesus never claimed to be God. And of course, this is most famously from Bart Ehrman, and Alex O'Connor likes to say this
Bart Ehrman.
as well.
Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in...
I have heard, I haven't investigated this. I have seen people on YouTube going back and forth in their thumbnails. This guy says Jesus never claimed to be God, and this is why he's wrong. Maybe I will learn something here.
John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear.
Now, you can read any gospel, and what you'll find is that Jesus forgives sins, as the Pharisees say that only God can do. He walks on water, as the book of Job says only God can do. He commands storms and the elements in general, as only God can do. He heals people on his own authority, as only God can do. He miraculously feeds people in the wilderness, as God did in Exodus.
Again, these are all claims. These are all things that are written about Jesus. Jesus didn't write them himself. We can agree on that. These are claims being made about Jesus by somebody writing something like 40 years after his death.
He has authority over the demons, as God does. He is told by a voice from the heavens, "You are my son." He calls himself the Son of Man, as a nod to the prophet Daniel, who said that only the Son of Man would rule an eternal kingdom. He predicts his own crucifixion and resurrection. He claims he will ride the clouds and sit at God's right hand, which is a nod to the Old Testament prophecy, "The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand." And indeed, he calls himself Lord, a term for God, in several other contexts. And he claims that he will judge the world. And he quotes victorious prophecies from the cross and leaves behind an empty tomb. And Ehrman...
Again, I just want to drill on this, just so that we're very clear. These are things that are being asserted that Jesus said and or did. We don't know if that is true. Certain people believe it is, certain people believe it isn't, but we're talking about a text here in Mark that is the foundation for Matthew and Luke, which means it must be the first one written, right? Chronologically. If you are copying from a text, that text must already exist, right? And most people would put Mark at around 70, which is 40 years after the death of Jesus. So, how do we know that what Mark is writing, or whoever Mark is, he doesn't claim to be Mark, it's attributed to Mark, but the author of Mark doesn't claim to be a guy named Mark, and we don't know who wrote it, but assuming that Mark was totally being honest, that's still 40 years of difference. And people could have been lying to Mark. People could have been telling him stuff that he didn't know. We don't have Mark. We have copies of Mark. Doesn't mean that they were changed, but we don't know because we don't have Mark. And we have a lot of textual changes that are minor. As I'm sure Kory would point out, there are a lot of changes, but there are minor changes, right? Just spelling errors, or maybe a word gets repeated or something by a scribe who was falling asleep. Not sure. I'm willing to accept that there aren't a lot of In this manuscript, Jesus claims to be God, and in this one, Jesus says, "I'm not God." Right? We don't have those sorts of errors, but we know that there was a pretty strong condemnation of heretical teachings, and some of those texts don't survive, so we don't know what they were teaching, and we don't know what happened in between the composition of the manuscript, the autograph of Mark, and our first copies of it. Right? We don't know if there were changes or not.
Connor see all this and say, yeah, but he didn't technically say, I do hereby declare that I am Yahweh. Well, at least not in the earliest gospel. He just calls himself the Son of Man there. This commits the fact.
Son of Man is Jewish. That's a Jewish thing. Right? It's similar to Messiah in that it's somebody who's anointed by God. It doesn't mean God. It means that, similar to David, right? David was anointed. God basically gave him authority as king. Samuel poured the oil on his head. God said, "This is the king that I'm choosing to lead Israel, and I'm giving him authority." Nobody claims that David was divine, and nobody claims that David was part God or anything like that. It's just David was the anointed, which is what Messiah means. He was the anointed person who was leading Israel. The claims of Son of Man are specifically Jewish. We lose that context in the modern time because it's been 2,000 years and Christianity has colored most of what we see, right? Because I grew up Christian. I grew up in a world where the way we interpret the Bible has been sort of decided on already. And so we're reading it through those lenses and we're making our own assumptions. But Son of Man is not a claim to divinity.
Fallacy of, please take off your atheist-colored glasses before you run into a wall. The evidence speaks for itself. And as I always tell the jury, you are allowed to use your common sense. Another comment I've gotten several times is something like, there's no coherent definition of God, and I'm not going to believe in your God until you've given me a coherent definition of him. This represents a view known as agnosticism, or theological non-cognitivism. So let me
That's not how I define my version of agnosticism, but I'm interested to find out what I believe.
summarize the Christian view of God. God creates the universe.
Okay.
He calls himself I am at the beginning of the Bible, which is a way of saying that he's the one thing that simply exists because he exists. He made us
Right.
in his image such that we are rational, interpersonal beings. He spoke through many prophets. He demonstrated his love and personality and power through Jesus. He is the essence of wisdom and power and love, the fountain of all of these things. That's what
Okay.
I'm talking about when I talk about God. Now, rather than
Fair
fixating
enough.
on this coherent concept, agnostics like to redirect our attention to certain philosophical difficulties. How can God be both three and one? How can an immaterial being affect our mentality?
That is a good question. And that is one of the questions that has divided Islam and Christianity for a very long time. Is how can God be just one God, monotheism, but have three different beings that are all independent, sort of? Are they independent? Are they dependent? Dan McClellan actually just responded to somebody who was making an argument like this. So maybe I'll link that in the description. I think I am going to post this as a standalone video. So Dan McClellan did a response to somebody else who was making this claim on TikTok, I think, that
The real world. How can God exist outside of time?
dependence versus independence. Is Jesus independent of God or dependent on God? Right? And I'm sure it's a meaningful conversation to have. I totally understand why it looks like polytheism to people outside of Christianity. I 100% understand that because it does, and Christians have been wrestling basically since the beginning of Christianity with how to square there being three entities in heaven, but they're all the same God, but they have different expressions, right? The Holy Spirit, we don't really talk as much about the Holy Spirit as we do about God and Jesus, and we don't have as coherent a definition. I'm sure Kory has a really good definition of the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Spirit is not heavily discussed in the New Testament. There's comforting spirit, the intercessor, there are some things that we know about it, but I mean, it's God, right? It's fully God, but it's also independent from God. And so I think the way most people try to square that is that, like, these are various expressions and personalities of God, right? Different roles that God fulfills. And that's how Jesus was able to be on earth and still be fully God, but also fully... Again, we are into the supernatural. And I don't really put a lot of credibility on the supernatural, right? You have to accept that the supernatural exists to believe any of this stuff matters, and I don't. I don't believe that there is supernatural things. But I could be wrong. I understand that I could be wrong. Then you have to deal with the complicated questions of how can God be three and also one, which again, Christian philosophers and apologists have been doing since like the time of Augustine, since Irenaeus, right, the early church fathers, the doctrine of Trinitarianism. This has been a long-standing problem. But as somebody who generally would say, I don't believe that the supernatural exists, I don't have to deal with those questions, because if the supernatural doesn't exist, then I don't have to figure out how to justify God being three and also one.
And these are challenging ideas, but if a prerequisite to believing something exists is to comprehend every detail of it, you will cease to believe that anything exists. Dig deep enough and everything becomes incomprehensible. The universe, human consciousness, quantum mechanics, after all.
We don't understand human consciousness, and we don't really understand quantum mechanics. We really don't understand the brain. We have some ideas about how the brain works, but we really don't understand the brain. And that's in our own bodies. We can actually look at that and like operate on it and take little slices and see what it does. We can't do that with the creation of the universe or the resurrection or Jesus turning water into wine. We can't test those.
Well, it's often been said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't. And quantum mechanics are a feature of our universe. It's one thing to believe that something exists, and quite another to understand and comprehend every facet of that thing. If you make your belief in the universe contingent on grasping quantum mechanics, you are not being rational. And a fortiori, if you make your belief in the God who created our universe contingent on grasping every facet of his nature, you are not being rational. And since agnostics couldn't possibly live under this,
I will just respond to this by saying the Bible says everything is for you to know and to understand. So I guess God thinks that we are capable of understanding, and or that verse is meant to be more figurative. You know, I'm not trying to really drill on this, okay? But if I can't understand it, why did God say I would be able to understand it? Now, God also says the wisdom of man is the foolishness of God, right? So just to address that point, sure. Okay. If God is real and exists, he certainly is bigger and smarter than me. And he can do things that I can't imagine, right? He can do things that are supernatural. He can do things, I guess he can do things that break the law of physics. Well, I have not yet seen anything that breaks the laws of physics, so I would need to be convinced more deeply. Quantum mechanics fits in with our physics model of the universe, right? It explains some of the things that we had trouble understanding, and now with quantum mechanic models, it makes more sense. I am not a quantum mechanic expert. Do not ask me to go into it because I do not know. But I do know that the discipline of quantum mechanics is based on the same sorts of principles and scientific, not to be a scientific guy, but it's based on those principles, and it's based on saying, well, hey, we predict that this will happen. And if this is real, then we would expect to see this. And then that is what happens. And so through scientific testing and theory and experimentation, you find out, hey, this actually does line up with the understood laws of the universe. It does not go outside the laws of physics, even if it is difficult for us to understand, right? It is predictable.
refuse to believe in what I cannot comprehend standard, they are committing these special pleading and stacking deck fallacies, imposing an unreasonable standard to avoid.
A lot of fallacy talk.
Another idea that has come up several times is the claim that
I just can't imagine how much fun it would be to be with somebody who's like, excuse me, you're doing a stacking the deck fallacy. Okay. You are fun at parties.
the Bible condones slavery.
I'm not fun at parties either,
So,
for the
or
record.
on a similar note, they will focus not so much on the Bible as on Christians themselves, claiming that Christians have done a lot of really terrible things.
I have also brought this up. This is also something that is directly relevant to me. So, I don't think the Bible is terrible. I don't think all Christians are terrible. but I do think the Bible has been used as justification for many terrible things done by the people who believe it. And in some cases, done by the people who just think it's useful. They don't even believe in it, but they value it as a weapon. Okay, so that's my stance. My stance is that a whole lot of Christians have done very terrible things based on their understanding of the Bible. And the Old Testament explicitly does call for genocide. The New Testament does not. It's different. The New Testament doesn't say you shouldn't have slaves. And it doesn't say that women have any rights. But it is not the same as the Old Testament. And it certainly is not nearly as conquest-oriented as the Old Testament is. So, again, just to maybe cut off that misunderstanding, we'll just define ourselves right here.
Here's an example of what that might sound like.
Religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the
True.
right to practicing homosexual, wrong about
True.
the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about
True.
both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the
True.
evolutionary ancestry of every.
For example, the Bible says the Lord made two lights, one to rule the day and one to rule the night. I've talked about this before. The moon is not a light. The moon does not have light of its own. I'm not saying this to impeach the Bible because, as somebody like Kory or any good Christian would point out, the Bible is not a scientific textbook. Fair enough. I don't think that that's enough evidence to say you can't trust anything in there because this guy writing in Psalms thought that the moon was like the sun and had its own light source. Okay, I just point that out to say that is wrong, right? That is factually incorrect. That guy saying that the moon is a light is incorrect. It functions as a light because it is bright at night, but it does not have any light of its own. It is not a star. It does not give off light. It only reflects light. Much like a Christian would reflect the glory of God, right? Moses, when he came out of the tabernacle and he had to cover his face because it was shining, he was not God, but again, according to the story, he was reflecting the glory of God. It was so powerful that it stuck to his skin, and he made him glow, and it would scare the people. And also, they wanted to hide the fading of the glory because the glory didn't stay on Moses forever, right? The sun and the moon are not always visible in the sky at the same time. Sometimes they are, and sometimes the moon is visible way into the day. But at a certain point, the moon goes away as far as we're concerned, right? We can't see it anymore. Similar to the glory of the God leaving the face of Moses. So they would cover his face so that the people wouldn't see and be saddened by the glory of God leaving.
Animal, including the human animal, on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property.
Wrong. That is absolutely
Wrong.
proved over and over again.
Wrong. Wrong. Now, on the subject of human rights atrocities, Jesus said that his entire way of life can be summed up in two commandments. Love God, and because other people are made in God's image, love them.
Sure.
And on a
Love your
second,
neighbor.
He says that whatever you do to the least of people, you are doing to him. So no one in their right mind would read
Sure.
the Bible cover to cover and think that it's ever okay to demean or belittle or
This is a no, not to get into fallacies because I'm not one of those guys, but this is a no true Scotsman, right? Lots of people read the Bible cover to cover and then did atrocities, largely based on what they believed the Bible wanted them to do. You can say that they weren't in their right mind, I guess, which sort of, okay, no true Scotsman, right? No true Scotsman would ever drink this brand of alcohol. Well, I saw somebody drinking this brand of alcohol just the other day. Well, he's not a true Scotsman then, right? That's the way that argument works. If there were a lot of John Newton was a smart guy, and he wrote a very important song that we sing a lot in church, and he was a slave trader, and he read the Bible. Does that mean that he was not in his right mind when he was doing slave? I mean, again, you can make that argument. You could say that no one in their right mind would be a Nazi. And I would agree that based on how I look at the world, I don't see how you can listen to Nazi ideology and agree with it and be normal. But that's unfortunately a lot of normal people, reasonable reasonable people would agree. For scientific reasons of eugenics, right? My point being, you can't really make this argument in any seriousness.
Oppress or exploit anyone, not even your worst enemy. Of course, the Bible can be twisted to promote all sorts of terrible things. Anyone.
Right? No good Christian. See, no good Christian would do that with the Bible. But a lot of Christians did that with the Bible, but they weren't good Christians. But the people around them thought they were good Christians. Yeah, but we know now with our modern morality, looking back, that they were wrong. Right? That you understand, this argument does not really matter to me. No good Christian. Well, okay, then there have been a lot of really bad Christians, I guess, who didn't understand the Bible. But that is not, I don't think that's a good defense. You're saying the Bible's that easy to misunderstand and twist that people have used it as a cudgel for 1,500 years? That's not great.
The Soviet Union's scientific atheist party was nothing for scientists or atheists to be proud of, nor were Nietzsche-loving Nazis. But
sure. He just actually brought this up in a response to me about Nietzsche and Nazis. I don't know if this is based in anything. I don't know if he believes that and again, I'm not misrepresenting his beliefs. That he said this to me in a statement that he believes that Nietzsche was really a big part of not the rise of Nazism. I don't know if that's true. He believes it's true. I have not done any investigating to prove or disprove it. So for the moment, I am just going to let that pass because I don't know. It doesn't hugely affect my opinion one way or another. I don't care. I read Thus Sprak Zarathustra and I thought it was tedious. I'm not a Nietzschean, but I don't care. I don't really care if the Nazis were inspired by Nietzsche or not, or if it was part of them were and part of what does it matter at the end of the day? They were largely inspired by Americans. It's like the eugenics movement was birthed in the USA and they were big fans. So okay.
The Bible to support that sort of thing. Atheism, on the other hand, has social Darwinism and moral chaos built right in. And atheism offers zero safeguards when fellow atheists like Nietzsche believe the strong and wealthy should crush the poor and powerless. That's why post-Enlightenment atheism was so devastating. In the words of historian Jeffrey Burton Russell, atheist rulers such as Lenin, Hitler...
Who's Jeffrey Burton Russell? American historian. He's still alive. He's writing books on the geography of heaven. Oh, no, he's dead. We'll look at his wiki page. Medieval Europe and religious studies scholar. UC Berkeley, PhD from Emory. Okay. 5-volume history of the concept of the devil. Could be interesting. Inventing the flat earth. Okay. Some stuff about the history of heaven. Fulbright, Guggenheim. I mean, this guy seems like a legit scholar, legitimate academic. I have no dispute about his credentials,
Stalin.
which is nice because with Jim, so often the people he's referencing are just like, oh, and this guy is just a Nazi. This guy doesn't exist, Okay, so atheist rulers such as Lenin, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and Pol Pot, tortured, starved, and murdered more. Yeah, this is anti-communism, basically. This is a classic. Now Hitler obviously is in here. This is sort of, let me be fair. This is the same sort of argument about anti-communism that people make, talking about the communist black book of how they killed 100 million. Okay, first of all, those numbers are not reliable, but this is about atheism specifically and not communism. So we'll move on from that. One of the reasons that this is possible, and again, I don't know if he can prove this number. I don't know what his basis is. All the combined religious regimes of the world up until Rome. or I guess up until Jesus. But one of the reasons they were able to do that is because there were a lot more people just alive. There were just more people living on the earth, right? The global population is something like 8 billion now, give or take a few hundred million, I would say, on either end. Global population in 1850 was, what, 2 billion maybe? So again, I'm not saying this to excuse what Pol Pot did. Okay, so they say around 1900, we were looking at about 1.6 billion people. An increase of 30% over the last 50 years. So now we have 6 times that, something like that. It's not necessarily an accurate representation if you look at pure numbers versus if you look at percentages, I guess. There's a better word for it that is eluding me at the moment. But if you consider, based on how many people there were at the time of these various atheist rulers, versus the amount of people there were in, say, the ancient Near East, right, in Assyria, or in the Roman Empire, right? We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, maybe not even hundreds of millions, maybe 100 million. I don't know. I don't have an idea of what population estimates for the Roman period are, but I do know that medicine and infant mortality rates have done a great deal to help increase population, especially in poorer countries. So I listen, you're not going to catch me out here defending Hitler or Stalin or Mao or Pol Pot. I am more likely to defend Lenin in some aspects. But the rest of these guys, take them. I don't give a shit. I don't want these guys. So I'm not trying to defend them with this. I'm just trying to make the point that, in the 20th century, there were a lot more people alive to be killed than there used to be. So maybe that is a factor in why so many more people have been killed. Again, how does he know what the numbers are? How does he know what the numbers are from the Crusades and the the anti-Jewish pogroms and genocides over the Middle East? How does he know? I don't know. He doesn't say. Maybe in his book he says, but he doesn't say it here.
Tortured, starved, and murdered more people in the 20th century than all the combined religious regimes of the world during the previous 19 centuries. Post-Enlightenment Christianity gave us unprecedented human rights. Post-Enlightenment atheism gave us unprecedented human atrocities. If the avoidance of slavery, genocide, rape, violence, and so on are reasons to avoid a worldview, atheism will be the first to go. And Christianity, the greatest...
That's an interesting statement to make. I would dispute that. I'm not going to say that all atheists are excellent human rights advocates, but I did just bring up the anti-Jewish pogroms. Pogroms is a specific word for anti-Jewish, basically extermination campaigns in Russia. So pogrom has a specific definition. I am not using it as specifically as I should. Basically, throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the early centuries, anytime there was a problem, the plague broke out, or there were economic hardship, Christians would ride through the Jewish quarter, killing Jews and looting their belongings. That's just, we know that happened many, many times over hundreds of years. And then, of course, you have the Holocaust, where the Germans were kind of surprised that we weren't on board, because everybody knows, we've known for 1,500 years that the Jews are bad, right? We just decided that we were going to change our perspective on that. But anti-Semitism is still a big problem in the U.S., and it was certainly a big problem in the 1920s, right? In America was a largely Christian nation in the 1920s.
rights the world has ever seen will be the last one standing. As for the other claims about Christians getting certain things wrong, this commits a fallacy called chronological snobbery, essentially holding historical cultures to modern standards. Because what you have to keep in mind is that everyone of every worldview is getting these things wrong, including scientists. So if you hold to scientism or empiricism and believe that science is the best means of uncovering truth, you can't make this argument, because I can just as easily list things that scientists got wrong, both scientifically and morally, just as I can list them.
Scientists have gotten things wrong? Absolutely. And then what, did we continue to believe those things that science got wrong, or do we move on from those things? Well, except for how to properly medicate women, because something I know that maybe a lot of people don't know, women are often excluded from clinical trials because they throw off the results because their bodies function differently than men's bodies do, right? The hormone balances are different, and so they just don't allow women in a lot of trials because maybe you get results that aren't useful, which also means that then you're only designing some of these medications to interact properly with men's bodies. Here's one. They were testing period pads, with water and not with blood, or with a similarly viscous substance as blood, because the people doing the tests were men and they weren't thinking about it, right? So the way science is supposed to work is you believe a thing and you test the thing and you find out if that thing is based in fact or not. Is it replicable? Do you get the results that you expect to get from your hypothesis? If you don't, you should reject it and you should move on to something else, right? And this is, at least mostly, what has been done in scientific disciplines. When you find out that something doesn't work, you reject it and you move on and you keep testing to find something that does work. You do not, one of our earliest physicians was doing science based on sheep. Well, we are not the same as sheep, and we no longer do science based on treating humans as if they have the same sorts of circulatory systems and all that as sheep do, because we're different than sheep. But that was the best information available at the time, and it was better than what they had before. It's just that it eventually more knowledge came out, and they were able to do more testing, more comprehensive understanding developed, and they moved on. That's how science is supposed to work.
Major scientific and moral innovations that were spearheaded by Christians for Christian reasons. And in fact, Christianity makes the very idea of moral progress coherent. A Christian can say certain historical atrocities were wrong because they violated the foundational Christian value of unconditional love for all people. And progress happens.
Ooh, I will agree that that is supposed to be the fundamental Christian value. I will not agree that it is. But I will agree, again, we're kind of into no true Scotsman here, right? I will agree that Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor. And further, who's my neighbor? Everyone's your neighbor, right? Although in this case, the story of the Good Samaritan, I am guilty of misunderstanding it for a long time. Because I didn't really understand the dynamics as much of Jewish and Samaritan theology. But we don't think we have to get into that. Anyway, the point Jesus was making was even your ideological opposition is your neighbor, right? Because he helped the guy who needed help. I agree. That should be the heart of Christianity. It is not often the heart of Christians. But again, you can say, well, they're not real Christians because well, okay. Are you a real Christian if you don't raise your hands in worship? Because Paul said you're supposed to do that, but most people don't. Are you a real Christian if you don't cover your head if you're a woman? Because Paul said you have to do that, but that was cultural, we think, and so most people don't bother. Again, we can argue all these little points about what makes a true Christian, but there are a lot of people that would assert that they are Christians that do not live up to the sorts of things that we would say should be hallmarks of Christians.
We move toward that standard. Atheism offers no such standard, no moral compass, no possibility of progress because there's nothing to progress toward. We're just ever evolving to perpetuate our selfish genes, and so we're governed by the zeitgeist, the current cultural moment. And let's hope our culture doesn't latch back onto Nietzsche's moral system and drive us toward another Holocaust. If they do, you can be sure that Christians...
I'm going to just point out here, I don't know what Kory's stance is on Israel-Palestine. So I don't want to draw any conclusions, and I don't want to assert anything. I don't want to accuse him of taking a side. But if you are not able to see that what Zionism and the Israeli government, backed with United States money and munitions, and backed by many, many Christians, many, many people who would claim to be Christians, go to church every Sunday. I know that that doesn't make you a Christian. Don't get lost in the illustration. Many people who would fully believe that they are Christians are fully on board with the Zionist cleansing, genocide, Holocaust of Gaza and the extended Palestinian community. It is happening. It is happening. It is not theoretical. There have been multiple genocides since the Holocaust, some led by Christian nations and some not. But right now, there is one ongoing. I will put a link to the Noah Samson video that I was watching today that sort of refreshed my memory on some of the things that I had been not thinking about as much recently. It's an hour long, so you gotta have some intestinal fortitude to watch it. It's not fun, but it is sobering. Anyway, if you don't understand that that is happening now and you're not willing to acknowledge that, I have a hard time taking you seriously. I'm just going to say that in general. I don't know Kory's stance, okay? I'm just saying in general, if you cannot look at what is happening in Palestine and say, that's a genocide, what is happening is completely immoral and wrong, I don't think you have to be a Christian to say that. And a lot of Christians won't say that. My dad would not say that it was wrong, which is hugely troubling for me. My dad's a preacher and one of the people I respect the most in the world, and yet he's an American, and he's an American Christian, and much of his view of the Middle East has been colored by the experience of being an American Christian.
Myself will be at the forefront of the resistance. We always have been, because that sort of thing has always violated the Christian ethos and always will.
A lot of alwayses in this. I'm not going to get too into the weeds, but just say, when people say always, never, exclude, those sorts of phrases should make you question, right? Because always, Christians always have been at the forefront. Christians, in many cases, have been at the front of societal progress, but not always. And in some instances, Christians have actively worked to undermine progress. So I don't think you can say this. We're going to get into Claim 6, which I will link a Dr. Josh Bowen video about the Bible condoning slavery as well, so that if Kory has any interest in looking into that, he can watch that before he gets into this further.
Appeal to historical errors also commits the nirvana fallacy, which is the idea that just because I don't like the current system, any alternative would be better. So there are things you don't like about Christianity or things that Christians have done that you don't appreciate, and so you'll trade it out for anything. A witty example of the nirvana fallacy is the quote often attributed to Winston Churchill: "Democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others that have been tried." Just because you don't like the best available solution doesn't mean there's a better alternative. And if I haven't already made this clear, atheism has produced far greater harms than Christianity has, and not half of them.
Again, that's a claim. I would need you to quantify harm to back this up, right? What we can say is that non-Christians have done really horrible atrocities, and also Christians have done really horrible atrocities. And the problem is that Christians are not supposed to do them. Non-Christians have no moral code, right? They don't. Atheists, godless heretics like myself, we have no moral code. We have no foundation for morality, as Christians like to point out. So there is nothing to stop me from just being a domineering warmonger who is trying to conquer everybody that doesn't look like me. There's nothing stopping me because I have no foundation for morality. But Christians do. And since the first century, Christians are supposed to know, love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Be a good slave if you're a slave. Be a good master if you're a master. This has been part of the church teaching since the first century. So you have a bigger problem when people know this is the moral foundation that we're supposed to live through, and they don't respect it, or they manipulate it for their own means, as opposed to people who aren't. My dad said, I used to ask people to stop swearing, especially if it was in front of me, if he was in front of my son. But then I decided, why would I ask them to follow the same rules that I have to follow? They're not Christians. They don't believe in God. They are not subject to the same laws or rules or guidelines that I am. And if what I have to say about the Bible is true and accurate, then they've only got one life to enjoy not being Christians, because after that it will be not very pleasant, right? Because they'll be in hell. So I'm not going to ask somebody who is not a Christian to live according to my Christian morality, because they didn't sign up to follow those rules. Why should they? Why shouldn't they drink and have prostitutes and go do, all that stuff? Why shouldn't they do that? Because they are only governed by material consequences, by the law, whereas Christians are governed by eternal consequences, spiritual consequences.
Good. It is not an improvement on Christianity. One final thing I should point out is that the crucifixion of Jesus was orchestrated by the religious leaders of the very religion that he came to fulfill.
Oh, now, those of you who have watched me go through Jim's videos, James Wickstrom, will notice, I think, hopefully, that a very, very common, and let me back up here and just say I'm not accusing Kory specifically of doing this, okay? I am just commenting on a pretty common and historical anti-Semitic trope, which is the Jews killed Jesus. Now, some people would say they actually were given permission to do it themselves, but most people would not argue that, right? The Romans occupied Judea. They had power of capital punishment. The Jews didn't. So they had to go get permission from the Romans to kill him. Now, Matthew is a reasonably anti-Semitic text, and seems to really want to emphasize that the Jews were the ones who were asking to kill Jesus, right? Let his blood be on us and on our descendants, is in Matthew. But that is classical anti-Semitism to draw those conclusions. I'm just saying that maybe Kory is not aware of the historical connotations of the Jews killed Jesus, but I will just say, if you are a person who engages with that line of thinking, the company that you share is some of the most hardcore white nationalists and anti-Semites that I have had the disappointing privilege of encountering. Again, much like believing in ancient aliens, just because there is a thing that you have heard that you think is reasonable or is interesting doesn't mean you understand all the conspiracy behind it. But I am now explaining for everybody to understand. The Jews killed Jesus thing is classic anti-Semitism. One of the early classic anti-Semitic arguments. I'm just going to say that so that we don't have to engage with it anymore.
Paul warns in the first century that wolves in sheep's clothing will enter the church. In other words, that people who call themselves Christian will cause lots of harm. And in general, religious leaders are some of the Bible's greatest.
No true Scotsman. This is now at least the third instance of this that I have noticed.
Villains. So Christianity doesn't just explain how it can be horribly misused. On Christianity, we expect that. The last idea that has come up numerous times is this question. If complexity implies a designer, then who designed God? So this is a response to the teleological argument, which is basically that the complexity and functionality of our universe evidences a designer. And asking...
I don't make this argument. Maybe other people do. I'm willing to accept that. I don't. I have other things that I think are more impeaching of the existence of God than who designed God.
Designed God commits the fallacy of false equivalence. It is simply not rational to impose the qualities of something designed on down to its designer. You might as well ask, if this canvas must have been painted, then who painted the painter? Our observable universe, for instance, began to exist, which places it in the category of contingent things, but something has to exist simply because it exists, otherwise nothing will exist. And Christians believe that if you drill down to the base level of reality, God would be there saying, I am, as in I am the one thing that simply exists. He would be the one thing that's necessary and not contingent. And since our observable universe began to exist, it is categorically different from him. Atheists like to call special meaning here and claim that Christians are using a double standard, but this just illustrates that they don't understand the perfectly rational categorical distinction that's being made. So there you have it. We've reviewed some common atheist one-liners and at least some of the fallacies that they commit. Let me know if there are any other topics you would like to see covered. This channel is still very new and I'm open to suggestions. And atheists, do be advised that I've been tallying up your dislikes, of which there are hundreds, and donating $1 for every one of them to the NCFCA, which is a national Christian speech and debate organization that I periodically judge for.
It feels like a waste of money, but good for you, I guess. I mean, there are more useful places you could put that money than training apologists to try to dunk on atheists, but that's good. It's good to be generous. It's good to give your money. I totally endorse that. I have no, again, I do think it's a little silly to be like, hey, for every dislike, I give $1 to future apologists of America so that they can dunk on atheists. But I got no issue with saying I am taking the criticism that I'm receiving and I'm redirecting it into something positive. As the Bible says, I believe Joseph said, that which you have intended for evil, God has worked for good. Okay, fine. I'm absolutely happy for you to do that, Kory. If you want to give away your money to a debate team, you are welcome to do that, and it is certainly more useful than just not doing anything. I wholeheartedly am behind you on that.
I and for any future apologists, thank you for your engagement. So, God bless you.
He thanks me for my engagement. Okay, that is the video. I think I am going to post this as a separate video on my channel. It's going to be, I mean, it's an hour 40. It's probably an hour 20 of me actually going through stuff. But yeah, I'm going to post this. And I'm going to let Kory know that I did a review of his video and that he is welcome to watch my video, make comments, respond to it if he wants, engage with what I have mischaracterized. I personally, and I am certainly a biased source on this because it is my video and it's my person. I feel like I did a fairly non-antagonistic job here. I tried not to be looking for, big points to fight about. I tried not to be, making accusations about people. I did bring up the anti-Semitism thing because it is valid to note. But I'm not accusing Kory of being an anti-Semite. Let's just be clear about that. We will see. We will see. I tried to be reasonable and thoughtful, and hopefully, if Kory decides he wants to watch this and engage with it, he will appreciate the approach I took. And maybe he won't, and maybe this will make him really mad, or maybe he'll just think I'm a moron. These things are all possible.